Good afternoon. Welcome to Facts and Issues. I'm Marie Curtis for the League of Women Voters, and with me this afternoon is a fellow League member, Lois Kiely, who is also an author. Her writing appears in this recent book of Chicken Soup for the Soul in the Military Families edition. And Lois, why don't you tell us how this all came about?
Oh, I'd love to. And Marie, thank you very much for inviting me on the show. Well, a number of years ago, Peggy Dellinger, who is in charge of the exhibits at the Township of Ocean Historical Museum, asked me if I had any memorabilia or souvenirs or mementos that I would be willing to share for a World War II exhibit. She knew that my dad had been in World War II. He had passed away in service. And I said to her, you know, my mom left a big box for me to go into, and I just never have had the heart to go into it. So let me look and see. So I did that, and we had the exhibit, and there was a very nice display of my father's things. And then a few years ago, Peggy was doing another exhibit on World War II. And this time she put together this book, and I'll just show it to you a little bit, show it to the camera. And it has all of his letters, telegrams that my mom received, letters from the mayor of New York and Jersey City where he lived and grew up. And it's a beautiful book. And it got me thinking, really stimulated my thinking that I should write something about this, about the whole phenomenon of my dad going away and the story behind that.
Mm-hmm. And I gather your father must have been a very remarkable and well-loved man, because his friends came back and did something super spectacular after the war.
Yes, they did. Yes. Well, when my dad's friends returned from the war, they realized that he was not among them. And they wanted to do something very special to honor his memory. So they thought, and they said, well, I think he would have liked to have his daughter go to college. And then they decided to form an association called the Louis LaPointe Association. Louis LaPointe was my dad's name. So they did, and elected members, officers, let the word go out that they wanted members for this. And they did form this association successfully. They petitioned Jersey City to build a park in the neighborhood, named the Louis LaPointe Memorial Park. And for 20 years they held boat rides, card parties, raffles, and they raised the money to send me to college. So in 1965 I graduated with a degree in English from Monmouth College, which is now Monmouth University, and fulfilled their goal and their promise to my dad to educate his young daughter. So it's a very special story, and what I've come to find out is that not everyone had such a positive reaction in their community. I mentioned this to you once before, Marie. This is a book written by a woman who's a war orphan, because that's what I was called. That's what we were all called, war orphans, even though we had mothers. And there's an association called the American World War II Orphans Network. This was written by the woman who started the network, and she interviewed people whose dads died in battle. It's a very sad book, because many of them were depressed, confused, didn't understand why it was them, their family. And I met a woman who told me about this in Phoenix, Arizona. And I said, well, I want to join and be a part of that. So since then, I've been getting emails and communications, and it's had a very powerful effect upon me, a very healing effect. So that goes along with my dad's friends doing something very positive. This is also something very positive.
So how did your dad's story end up published in a book?
Well, after the second show that Peggy did, and I had this wonderful book together, I belong to two writing groups, and they often tell us when there's a call for stories, articles, essays. from different magazines or books. And there was a call for stories about military families in Chicken Soup for the Soul. Have you ever read any of the Chicken Soup for the Soul books?
Not an entire book. I've read excerpts.
That's what most people say. They have them for people who love history or dog lovers or stories about grandmothers and children. They're heartwarming stories. That's why they call them Chicken Soup for the Soul stories. You're feeling kind of down, you pick it up, and suddenly you read a story that just warms the cockles of your heart. And I thought, this might be the place for my dad's story, because they're only asking for something like 1,500 words. I sat down at the computer and looked through the book again and started to write. The name of the story is My Father's Voice, and that's because, as I noted in the story, I knew what my father looked like. He's a very handsome man. We had pictures in the house. And I knew his handwriting from the victory mail that you've seen this before, examples of it.
Yes.
It was the early photostating process and photocopying. All of the soldiers and sailors would write home, but they might unintentionally divulge sensitive information, so everything had to be screened, and the loved ones at home received this victory mail. I had a stack of these. And what I found in the mail and was something that struck me very deeply. People used to say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, so sad for you that you didn't have a dad." And I would say, "Well, it is, but I never knew him, so I didn't miss him." When I read these letters, Marie, I missed him.
Yes.
And the one thing that I didn't have, I had the image of who he was, I had his handwriting. I didn't know what his voice sounded like.
Yes.
And so I called it My Father's Voice. And I wrote it, sent it off, and I got notified that indeed they accepted it, and it was published. I was very excited. Called My Father's Voice. I never heard my father's voice. There were photographs of him, and I know his handwriting from the letters he wrote to my mother. But I always wondered, what did he sound like? Did his voice reflect the French-Canadian dialect of his parents' speech? Or did it have a masculine North Jersey sound to it? Was he soft-spoken or a deep baritone? I will never know, because he died in World War II when I was just an infant. It was then that I became what the government calls a war orphan.
Well, as I said, I think your father must have been a very special person.
I think he had a great personality. He was too young, he was in his early 30s, to have distinguished himself in a career of any sort. But I think he was a very likable person. That's what everyone said about him. Made people feel good, smiled often. So that's how I'd like to think of him.
Well, you had a very special group looking after you and your college education. But a lot of these war orphans were not so fortunate. At that time, were there any organizations that would help them?
There were very few. I know for my mother, there were Gold Star wives. Originally, the Gold Star mothers were mothers who lost, at that time, it was sons in battle. And they formed an organization, a support organization, that we would call it. Then there are Gold Star wives, but my mother didn't know about any of these things. Now there are still Gold Star mothers and Gold Star wives, Blue Star mothers and Blue Star wives, and those are women whose loved ones are still actively serving.
Yes.
But I do have a list that I don't know if the camera can pick it up, but there is, of course, the USO, and that's the United Service Organizations. It goes into camps and entertains the young men and women. They have activities, but they also include the families. So I think that's very important. Then there's an organization that I just recently learned about called TAPS, and that's an acronym for Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors. I was very impressed with what I saw. I saw it on this video. Video is called Gold Star Children, which is a much more positive phrase than war orphans, but war orphans was the traditional name for youngsters who lost one or two parents in war, even though they had a surviving parent. And they partner active duty soldiers or sailors, Marines, with young people who have lost a parent, and it's like a mentor-mentee relationship. They see them almost like a big brother, big sister kind of concept. Now, there's also disabled American veterans. There's another Sons and Daughters in Touch. That's a Vietnam organization. There's AWAN, which I belong to, American World War II Orphans. And someone asked me about how many orphans were there. There is not an exact count. The War Department did not keep track of how many orphans there were, but the estimate is about 183,000. But that's very rough because there were many children born during war times. Perhaps parents weren't married, and they probably would be classified as war orphans, but there is not a count. Then there's something called the Snowball Express, which I was very, very impressed with. And once again, I saw these in this video, Gold Star Children. Snowball Express brings children together from all over the country who have lost a parent, and they have activities for the families. And some of the parents have said, my child lives for this. Every year they look forward to December, which is a sensitive time of year because of the holidays. And they have activities for them. And, well, any others you'd like to ask me about? There's a whole list, so I don't want to go over the whole list.
Well, the Blue Star Highway Byway Memorials, there is one of those available to be seen locally, correct?
Yes, there is. As a matter of fact, one of the members of the Ocean Township Historical Museum, her name is Brenda, is responsible for the one in Interlaken, which is a town right next to us. And it's just a lovely way to pay tribute to the men and women who served and are currently serving. The highways are on highways that are designated as large thoroughfares. There's a sign that's official, and people raise money it's now the garden clubs who've taken it over, and they'll raise money for this official sign, and there's a big blue star on it. Now, the thing is, it must be accessible from a car or as you're walking, and so that's why Blue Star Highways and Byways. And there's if you don't have a big highway, but you still like to pay tribute, smaller roads, byways, can be selected, and that's what this friend of mine, Brenda, did in Interlaken, and it's a big rock, and on it is a plaque, and there's a big blue star, and it thanks the men and women who have served our country. So I think that's a lovely program.
It really is, and it brings back a reminder that, so many things that we take for granted were paid for with a very high price, not just by those who served or by the families they left behind.
Yes, I think we were talking earlier, and I said, now that we know so much about post-traumatic stress syndrome, I really feel that all of the families that were affected and are still being affected, and that's really one of the points of me publishing this story and continuing to promote it, is that it doesn't leave you. And there are war orphans being created, sadly, every day.
Yes.
Just because your dad passed away in the war, and people may say he died a hero, doesn't give you that sense of, what can I say, comfort or stability that people may assume you have, and that as you get older it fades. Being a member of the AWAN, the American World War II Orphans Network, I can see that all of us, including myself, think of our dads every day, wonder what it would be like to have a dad. And it just continues. So these organizations are very important, and having a boulder that has a plaque on it is a reminder that we really do need to honor our servicemen and women, because they put their life on the line, they put their boots on the ground, and they're willing to pay the greatest price. You had asked me earlier about the notification.
Yes.
Do you know something about it, or what?
Well, notifications now are different than they were back in your mother's day.
Yes, they are.
Everybody was notified by telegram, as I recall.
And people dreaded the telegram coming. They dreaded the man walking up the lane with the telegram. People didn't want to open the doors. They were in denial. And so in this book that I have, there's the telegram that my mother received, first saying that he was missing in action on October 24th in the mountains of Italy, fighting against German troops. And then in December, she received the final telegram that said that he had died on October 24th. Now there are two military personnel who come to the door in full uniform. Sometimes a chaplain comes with them if one is available. Sometimes the message is delivered by the National Guard people, if actual members of his or her unit are not available. And they deliver the news, and then they make a commitment to stay with the person, not physically, but stay in touch for 6 months and guide them through the process of funeral arrangements and paperwork that they have to fill out. And I often think of my mother. She was in her 20s. This is in the 40s. Women usually weren't exposed to a lot of paperwork. The man of the house did the paperwork.
Yes.
I think of her sitting by herself doing this paperwork, and it just breaks my heart. But she did it.
She did. And you mentioned keeping in touch and helping to make arrangements. What kind of arrangements can be made when the serviceman, like your father, dies in Italy, far, far from home?
Many people, families, opted to have their loved one buried with his comrades. And I say his because really it was a male-dominated.
Yeah.
And so they're buried in Belgium and Luxembourg and France and all those places you see the Normandy flags. But 5 years later, the government gave widows and families the option of bringing home the remains of their loved one. My mother said she wanted to do it. And it was very wise of her because we had a wake. I think I was about 5 or 6 years old. People could come and express their condolences. And we had a military burial with the rifles and taps. And I still cry when I hear taps, no matter where I am. If I hear taps at a ceremony, it still brings tears to my eyes. But it brought closure to her. And we would go and visit the grave on Father's Day and his birthday. And she felt as if he was still close to her. And that's an option that families have. So, and the government does pay for that.
Okay. To go back just for a moment or two, you mentioned the two service people coming to the door. And one of the things in the book that you also share, is a poem about that. Would you care to share that with
I would.
our audience out there?
Excerpts from that. It's called A Knock on the Door. Safe in my home, there's a knock on my door. Who could it be? At 3:45. On a Tuesday of all days, while changing the bed, that knock fills me instantly, deeply with dread. Just who is standing out there in the sun? My heart begins pounding, my mind starts to run, not looking my best, but too worried to care, shaking and frightened at who's waiting there. Stealing my nerves, as all us wives do, I go to the window and peek on out through. Praying I don't see two men standing tall, somber in dress blues, delivering the call. But what I do see makes me take a deep breath. It's simply my neighbor who waits on the step. But a knock on the door can be more than it seems when your husband fights for the U.S. Marines. I read that and filled up with tears. It was written by a woman named Nicole Hackler, and I know that those feelings were feelings that my mother had. Of course, with the telegram, they didn't come in person in those days. And I know that in Vietnam, during the Vietnam War, there were so many telegrams that they just gave them to taxi drivers to deliver because they couldn't spare the personnel. So things have improved. Of course, we're not in an all-out war, thank heavens.
But the
And
fears remain.
yes,
The fear is still there. I know I have a friend whose son was serving in Afghanistan, and she couldn't bear to watch the news because she was so fearful.
yes. And I had that same experience. My son, Jason Guerin, was a helicopter pilot in Iraq. He retired 5 years ago as a lieutenant colonel. But when he was in the service and he was flying his helicopter in Iraq, I was nervous the whole time. And there was one day when I was in a little dress store in Oakhurst. The radio was on. I heard the radio say, breaking news, 2 choppers down in Iraq. All servicemen have been killed. I was about to try something on. I put it down and I said to the woman, I'm sorry, I have to leave. I drove home and I waited for the call. And the phone rang. And the voice on the phone said, it's all right, Mom, I'm okay. And I did write a story about that also, which I made as a bookmark. But that was a difficult time. I lived in fear, and I stopped watching the news. I just couldn't deal with it.
And I think that's just indicative of the kind of sacrifice that families make in these times. And as you said before, they go on making even today.
They do. But these organizations that we referenced do a lot of wonderful things, and I would urge people to remember that there are still families who need help. Care packages are wonderful. My friends sent a lot of care packages to Jason when he was in the service, and he would email me. Now we have email, so that makes it a lot easier. I got Dallas and Robert's care package. Please thank them. I got Aunt Donna's care package. So many people, I can't name them all, but those are things that we can do. And we can be sympathetic and empathetic for the people who have loved ones who are serving in our military. It just doesn't go away, the fear, the anxiety, and we need to support them. Because I was attending a program and I asked how many people had been in the service. Most of the people, or new people, most of the people in the audience raised their hand. When I asked how many people have children in the service, I was the only one and another person, only 2 people in the audience raised their hands. So a lot of people do not have that anxiety, but it's important to remember that those of us who do, we need to support them. And in this book that my story appears in, a portion of it automatically goes to the USO.
Yes.
And I think that's wonderful and very generous of Chicken Soup for the Soul for making that commitment.
Yes.
They not only talk the talk, but they do walk the walk and support our military.
And so do you. You have been selling the book and raising funds. And I think that is admirable as well. Are all of your funds aren't all going to the USO, though?
No, there are 3 organizations. I have made a decision not to make any money from the sale of the book. And so the Ocean Township Historical Museum is a significant part of who will be receiving the funds. And the Empower the Children, which is a philanthropic organization my friend started, and the Military Museum in the former Camp Evans. It's the Info Age Center. I did a book signing there and donated the funds to them. So that makes me very happy that I can, do something positive, making lemonade out of lemons.
Well, you certainly set forth a very impressive program and history here. I should mention also that we are recording this program here in the museum in the township of Ocean, because this is one of those little jewels that is not really known that broadly by the general populace. And
you're absolutely right. People come in from all over and they're just delighted with it. Hopefully our Ocean Township people know about it. They see it when they come into the library because it's right there, the Eden Woolley House. And this is now one of a number of exhibits that have been designed to support the military. This is World War I, and the artifacts here are just excellent. Then we did 2 on World War II. Peggy did smaller ones on Vietnam and Korea. So I think the museum is really doing its best to promote the history and embracing history and those who have fought to maintain our democracy.
I think too frequently, too, people think of history as facts in the past. And yet history is really what you've been telling us today. History is really people and people's experience and people's lives and people giving their lives for a purpose that is greater than themselves. And that, I think, is truly commendable. And I think we're getting toward the end of our time together.
Well, it's been delightful. I really appreciate you taking the time to interview me and also to promote the book. I should say that the book can be purchased on Amazon, and it can also be purchased on from the shelves of most bookstores. I know that Barnes & Noble does have a few copies, and the name of it again is Chicken Soup for the Soul for Military Families.
Well, thank you very, very much, Lois Kiely. On behalf of Facts and Issues, the League of Women Voters, I want to thank you very much for being here. And to all of you out there, as I mentioned earlier, Lois is also a member of the League, and you might want to join us. We have wonderfully interesting members. So it's Marie Curtis for the League of Women Voters saying we hope you'll be with us next time.
This is Mr. Lou Parisi.
I'm Lou Parisi, and this is my comrade Sam. We are both veterans of the Second World War, and as Lois mentioned, the greatest generation. And we are here to remind you, if you don't already know, that those difficult years of 1941 to 1945, when 406,000 American boys did not come back, while the saddest part of our history was also the golden age of American patriotism. And therefore, we are happy to thank, of course, Lois for sharing those thoughts about our comrade Lou, whom we never met. However, there's a bond that even though we've never met Lou LaPointe, we know that there is a bond that will forever be part of our legacy as well. And
As long as we're WW2 veterans, I'm here too. Well, I go to one further.
yes.
My father was in World War I, in the fight, and I followed him in World War II.
Well, you certainly have.
Your father was
Sorry.
Also, this is Bob Landis, who is our treasurer. He's also a World War II Navy veteran.